Berlin, 1943. An Abwehr officer examines Soviet interception reports and notices something impossible. Signals from a spy network Germany had captured months earlier were still being transmitted. Moscow was still responding, still trusting. When Hitler received the news, his reaction was calculated, cold, and revealed something far more dangerous than any betrayal. Why did those signals seem so convincing? Who was really controlling the information at that moment? What happened next would change the intelligence game of the war, and Stalin never realized it. Welcome to Deep History. Tell us where you're watching from, I'd really like to know. The discovery came through routine monitoring. German signals intelligence units, stationed across occupied territories, had been tracking Soviet radio traffic since the invasion began. By mid-1943, the pattern was familiar: encrypted bursts, scheduled transmissions, recognition codes that changed weekly. But in June of that year, analysts at the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin noticed an anomaly. A network they had rolled up in February, codenamed Rote Kapelle. The Red Orchestra was still active. The radio signatures matched. The encryption keys followed known Soviet protocols. And Moscow Center was responding with operational instructions, supply coordinates, and requests for strategic intelligence. The contradiction was absolute. The agents were in custody. Some had been executed. Others remained under interrogation at Gestapo facilities. Yet their radios were alive. Their handlers in Moscow showed no sign of suspicion. The traffic continued as if nothing had changed. For the Abwehr, this presented not a problem, but an opportunity. If Moscow still believed the network was operational, then Germany controlled a direct channel into Soviet intelligence. The question was not whether to exploit it, but how far the deception could be pushed before someone in the Lubyanka realized the truth. The operation that followed became one of the most sophisticated intelligence plays of the Second World War. It was built on a simple principle: trust is a currency, and once established, it can be spent slowly. The captured agents had provided everything: cipher keys, transmission schedules, authentication phrases, even the idiosyncrasies of their Morse code rhythm. German operators, trained to replicate these patterns, began sending carefully crafted reports. Not lies, exactly, tactical truths mixed with strategic misdirection. Real troop movements in sectors that no longer mattered. Accurate casualty figures from battles already concluded. Just enough verification to sustain credibility. Moscow accepted it all. The NKVD's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, chronically staffed 4 reliable sources inside the Reich, treated the reports as confirmed intelligence. They were filed, analyzed, and forwarded to the General Staff. Some reached Stalin's desk. The deception held because it followed the cardinal rule of successful disinformation: never contradict what the enemy can verify independently. The fabrications lived in the gaps, in the interpretations, in the subtle shifts of emphasis that redirected attention without triggering suspicion. But that wasn't the most critical part yet. Hitler's response, when briefed on the operation in July 1943, was characteristically direct. The meeting took place at the Wolfschanz, his East Prussia headquarters, in the presence of Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, and Heinrich Himmler, whose SS was already maneuvering to absorb military intelligence functions. According to Canaris's later testimony given during the post-war interrogations before his execution, Hitler listened to the briefing without interruption. Then he asked a single question: how long can we maintain the illusion? Canaris estimated 6 months, perhaps a year if managed carefully. Hitler's instruction was blunt: use it to cover Citadel, Operation Citadel. The planned summer offensive at Kursk was Germany's last major strategic gamble on the Eastern Front. If the deception network could mislead Soviet intelligence about the timing, scale, or direction of the assault, it might restore the element of surprise that had been lost since Stalingrad. The order was clear: the radio game would continue, and it would serve the Kursk offensive. The operation intensified. Through July and into early August, the compromised network transmitted a carefully orchestrated narrative. Reports suggested German forces were consolidating in the south, preparing for a drive toward the Caucasus oil fields. Other messages hinted at a defensive posture in the center, with units being rotated out for rest and refit. None of it was true. The actual build-up at Kursk, nearly 1 million men, 3,000 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces, was camouflaged under this radio fog. Every signal Moscow received from the controlled network pointed away from the salient. What came next would change everything. Soviet intelligence was not blind. The Red Army's main intelligence directorate, the GRU, maintained parallel networks that the Abwehr had not penetrated. Reports from these sources contradicted the Rote Kapelle traffic. Partisan reconnaissance confirmed massive German concentrations around Kursk. Radio direction finding detected the movement of entire corps. By late June, Stalin's intelligence summary included clear warnings. The Germans were preparing a major offensive, and Kursk was the target. The question facing Soviet command was which intelligence to trust: the consistent reports from a proven network, or the fragmentary evidence from less established sources. They trusted both, and prepared accordingly. The decision, documented in Stavka directives from early July, was to create defense in depth. If the Rote Kapelle reports were accurate, the preparations would deter a German attack. If they were deception, the fortifications would absorb it. Soviet engineers constructed 8 defensive lines, some extending 40 miles deep. Minefields were laid in densities previously unseen, over 5,000 anti-tank mines per mile of front in some sectors. The Red Army transformed the Kursk salient into a killing ground, regardless of what German intelligence believed Moscow believed. The German offensive began on July 5, 1943. Within hours, it was clear that surprise had not been achieved. Soviet artillery struck German assembly areas before the attack even started. The defensive networks were fully manned. Reserves were positioned for immediate counterattack. The radio deception had failed not because Moscow had discovered the truth about the compromised network, but because Soviet intelligence had developed redundancy. They had learned, through bitter experience, that no single source could be trusted absolutely. The lesson of 1941, when Stalin ignored warnings of the German invasion, had been internalized. No one in that room expected the next message. On July 12, as the Battle of Kursk reached its crescendo at Prokhorovka, the controlled Rote Kapelle network received an urgent query from Moscow Center. The message was brief, encoded in a cipher that should have been obsolete. It asked for confirmation of a specific intelligence report, one that had never been sent through the compromised network. The Abwehr operators, realizing they had been tested, did not respond. Silence was safer than a wrong answer, but the silence itself was an answer. Moscow had known, perhaps for weeks, that the network was under German control. The query was not a request for information. It was a notification. The game was over. Hitler's reaction to this final development was never directly recorded. Canaris was informed through Wehrmacht channels that the operation had been rendered ineffective and should be terminated. The captured agents who had been kept alive for potential reactivation were executed over the following months. The Abwehr itself began its decline. By 1944, it would be absorbed into the SS, and Canaris would be arrested for his peripheral connection to the July 20th plot against Hitler. The intelligence failure at Kursk was one thread in a larger unraveling, but the implications of the operation extended beyond its tactical failure. The episode revealed a fundamental shift in the character of intelligence warfare. Both sides now understood that networks could be compromised, turned, and weaponized. Trust was no longer a binary state, it existed on a spectrum, constantly recalibrated against multiple sources. The Soviet response to the Rote Kapelle deception became doctrine. Never rely on a single network, no matter how productive. Cross-reference everything, assume penetration. The paranoia was justified, and it became institutionalized. German intelligence never fully adapted to this new reality. The Abwehr continued to operate on the assumption that a well-placed agent or a successfully turned network could provide decisive advantage. This was the logic of an earlier era, when intelligence was scarce and therefore valuable. But by 1943, intelligence was abundant. The challenge was not collection, but verification. The side that solved that problem, that built systems to filter signal from noise, truth from deception, would hold the advantage. The Soviets, scarred by disaster and shaped by institutional suspicion, solved it first. The following report would destabilize the entire operation. Interrogation records from captured Abwehr personnel, taken by Soviet SMERSH units in 1945, documented the full scope of the radio game. These files were classified and stored in Moscow archives, unseen for decades. When portions were declassified in the 1990s, they revealed something unexpected. Hitler had been briefed not once, but 3 times on the operation's status. The first briefing, in July 1943, was the authorization. The second, in August, acknowledged that Soviet defensive preparations suggested the deception had been penetrated. The third, in September, confirmed it, yet the operation continued into October, transmitting reports that no one in Moscow was reading. Why? The answer lies in Hitler's approach to intelligence. He valued it not for its accuracy, but for its confirmation of pre-existing assumptions. If an intelligence report supported his strategic vision, it was credible. If it contradicted his plans, it was dismissed as enemy disinformation or defeatist pessimism from his own officers. The Rote Kapelle operation, even after its compromise was evident, continued because it aligned with Hitler's belief that Soviet intelligence could be systematically deceived. The failure was not technical, it was cognitive. This pattern repeated throughout the war. German intelligence operations were often sophisticated in design and execution, but they were undermined by a command structure that could not process information that contradicted Hitler's worldview. The Soviets, by contrast, operated under a dictator equally paranoid and equally willing to ignore intelligence, but their system had built-in redundancy. Stalin might ignore warnings, as he did in 1941, but the military intelligence apparatus continued to collect and distribute information through parallel channels. When Stalin changed his mind, the data was still there. The Kursk deception also had a human dimension that extended beyond strategic calculations. The captured Rote Kapelle agents, even those who had been coerced into cooperation, understood that their survival depended on the operation's success. When the radio game collapsed, their utility ended. Gestapo records from late 1943 show executions of agents who had been held in protective custody 4 months. Their cooperation had bought time, but not survival. The files note, with bureaucratic precision, that the executions were carried out in accordance with established security protocols. No explanation was required. The operation had failed, and witnesses were eliminated. For the German intelligence officers who ran the operation, the collapse carried different consequences. Some, like Canaris, would be caught in the broader purges that followed the July 1944 assassination attempt. Others survived the war and provided testimony to Allied interrogators, shaping the historical record. Their accounts, often self-serving, emphasized the technical sophistication of the deception while minimizing the strategic miscalculation. They described Hitler's reaction as pragmatic disappointment rather than rage, though other sources suggest differently. The truth, as with much of the intelligence war, remains layered with deception even in retrospect. Soviet intelligence drew explicit lessons from the episode. Post-war training manuals for NKVD and GRU officers used the Rote Kapelle case as a primary example of how to detect and manage compromised networks. The key indicators were catalogued: changes in transmission rhythm, reports that arrived too conveniently, intelligence that confirmed what the enemy wanted you to believe. The manuals emphasized a principle that would define Cold War tradecraft. Doubt is a survival skill. Trust only what can be independently verified. Assume your networks are penetrated. Operate as if the enemy is always listening. In this sense, the German deception succeeded not in misleading Soviet intelligence, but in training it. But something deeper was unfolding beneath these operations. The Battle of Kursk, which the deception was meant to support, became the largest tank battle in history. Over the course of 2 weeks, the Wehrmacht lost its offensive capability on the Eastern Front. German casualties exceeded 200,000. Nearly 800 tanks were destroyed or disabled. The Red Army's losses were higher, over 860,000 casualties, more than 6,000 tanks damaged or destroyed, but Soviet industrial capacity could replace them. German capacity could not. After Kursk, the Eastern Front became a slow, grinding retreat westward. The radio deception, which was supposed to restore German initiative, instead marked the point where initiative was permanently lost. Hitler's statement, when he finally acknowledged the operation's failure, was reported second-hand by Albert Speer in his post-war memoir. According to Speer, Hitler described the compromised network as a mirror we held up, only to find the Soviets had placed their own mirror behind it. The metaphor, if accurately reported, suggests Hitler understood the fundamental problem. Intelligence deception only works if the enemy doesn't know they're being deceived. Once both sides know, it becomes a game of who can sustain the illusion longer. In this case, the Soviets won because they never believed the illusion in the first place. The human cost of the intelligence failure at Kursk was absorbed into the larger catastrophe of the Eastern Front. The soldiers who advanced into prepared Soviet defenses, expecting surprise and encountering coordinated artillery barrages, did not know their attack had been compromised by a radio game gone wrong. They knew only that the promised breakthrough did not materialize. Survival became the objective. Retreat became inevitable. The intelligence war, fought in radio signals and decoded messages, translated into blood and fire on the battlefield. The connection between the two was documented in after-action reports filed by units that no longer existed. By the end of 1943, the Rote Kapelle network was officially closed. The last transmission, sent in October and ignored by Moscow, contained a fabricated report about German reinforcements being transferred to Italy. No response was received. The operators, following protocol, repeated the transmission the scheduled backup time. Still nothing. The silence was definitive. Moscow had moved on. The network that once promised strategic advantage had become a dead letter, a file closed without ceremony. For Stalin, the episode confirmed his deepest suspicions about intelligence operations. He had never fully trusted the Rote Kapelle network, even when it was genuinely productive. His paranoia, often destructive, proved useful in this instance. He demanded verification from multiple sources, which prevented the German deception from shaping Soviet strategy. But this same paranoia would later cripple Soviet intelligence, leading to purges and a culture of risk aversion that persisted long after the war. The lesson learned was correct, but it was overlearned. Trust became impossible, even when warranted. German intelligence, meanwhile, never recovered from the twin disasters of Kursk and the Abwehr's dissolution. The SS absorbed military intelligence functions in 1944, but the transition was chaotic. Experienced officers were sidelined or arrested. Networks in neutral countries were exposed. The institutional knowledge that had enabled operations like the Rote Kapelle deception was lost in bureaucratic infighting. By the war's final year, German intelligence was reduced to reading newspapers and interrogating prisoners. The sophisticated radio games of 1943 belonged to a different era, one that had ended at Kursk. What remained was a question that neither side ever fully answered. If Moscow had known the network was compromised, Why did they continue to receive the transmissions? The declassified Soviet files suggest a deliberate choice: allow the deception to continue, but ignore the content. By not shutting down the network immediately, Soviet intelligence prevented the Germans from knowing that their operation had been detected. This preserved other Soviet penetrations of the Abwehr that might have been exposed if the Germans realized the Rote Kapelle game was over. It was deception within deception, a hall of mirrors where both sides pretended to believe what the other was saying, while planning around the assumption that none of it was true. Hitler's final comment on the operation, recorded in a Wehrmacht liaison report from November 1943, was characteristically fatalistic. The enemy learned faster than we did. It was an admission that the war's momentum had shifted permanently. The German military, which had dominated the opening years through speed, surprise, and tactical innovation, was now reacting to Soviet moves rather than dictating them. Intelligence operations that once shaped campaigns were now desperate attempts to avoid complete disaster. The Rote Kapelle deception, conceived as a force multiplier, became instead a symbol of diminishing returns. The agents who died because of the operation's failure left almost no trace. Their names appear in Gestapo execution logs, dated between September and December 1943. No trials were recorded. No statements were preserved. They vanished into the administrative machinery of the Reich security apparatus, reduced to file numbers and processing dates. The same system that had tried to exploit them for strategic advantage disposed of them with the same bureaucratic efficiency. Their contribution to the war, coerced and ultimately futile, was erased as thoroughly as their lives. Another silent page of the war finally comes to light. Continue through our archive of forgotten operations. Tell us what you think in the comments, subscribe, leave your like, and share this video with 2 people you remembered while watching.